Namaste, everybody. You remember in the last session we stopped at verse 23. And if you remember, this is chapter 2, and Sri Krishna is trying very hard to describe the Atma, which he himself says is not describable, which he says is ancient, primordial, unchanging, unborn, undying. But then he starts to try to describe it in ways that we can somehow relate to and understand. So he says things like, if you remember, weapons cannot hurt it, fire cannot burn it, and so on. So now we're going to go on to verse 24, and Bhagavan is basically continuing with his attempt to describe the Atma in ways that we can relate to and understand. So, verse 24.
Yes. Verse 24. Achedyoyam adahyoyam akledyo shoshya evacha nityah sarvagatasthano achaloyam sanatanaha. So now, in previous verse, as Bhagavan said, that nainam chindanti sastrani means weapons cannot cut. But now Bhagavan is saying achedyaha. If somebody makes argument and say that weapons cannot cut, is there anything else can cut? So Bhagavan says no. Achedyaha, that means it is unbreakable. So it is unbreakable by anything. Adahyaha. Adahya means it is unburnable, or you cannot burn it. Akledyaha. Akledyaha means it cannot be wet. Asosyaha means it cannot be dry. So now Bhagavan is saying this is the nature of that it cannot be cut, or it cannot be dry, or it cannot be weighed, or it cannot be burned. That is the nature of Atma. Then he says Nityaha means which is always there. Sarvagataha, which is everywhere. Sthanu. Sthanu means indeed. Achalaha. Chalaha means which is movable. Achalaha means immovable. And Bhagavan said, which is sanatanaha. Sanatanaha, which is primordial. So Bhagavan says, this is the nature of Atma.
So translating it, the Atma, he says, is unbreakable, incombustible. It can neither be dampened nor dry. It is everlasting, movable, but simultaneously in all places everywhere. Unalterable, immutable, and primordial. Now we should look at the precise logic again in which Bhagavan speaks. You remember, he first mentions weapons. So now he says it is unbreakable. A weapon, of course, can be broken. He said the Atma cannot. Then he mentioned a fire, because remember, fire can burn a weapon. Now he says, but the Atma is incombustible. It cannot be burnt. Then he mentioned water. Water can put out a fire. But now he says, the Atma cannot be dampened. It cannot be put out by something that is a liquid. And then he mentioned the wind, which can dry water. But now he says, but the Atma, for its part, cannot be dried either. Then he chooses a very interesting word, sthanu, meaning something that can move, but whose energy is in all places everywhere. Now, with the two-slit experiment, yet 5,000 years away, it's fascinating that such a word even existed. Never mind that Bhagavan chose to use it in relation to the Atma. Now, in case we've not understood what he said in the previous verse, he now expresses it a different way. So let's examine each of the adjectives that Bhagavan has used. He says it's unbreakable. So you cannot, I'm going to continue with the example of the beam of light because it's a good example. Well, you can't break a beam of light by somehow catching it and dashing it to the floor. There's no way to catch it, there's no way to dash it. It won't help us if we throw something at the beam of light either. Not even anything as powerful as an atomic bomb. The bomb will go off. The only difference is that whereas the light would have lit a city before, it will now light up ruins. In the same way, Bhagavan is saying the Atma also cannot be broken. He then uses the next word. He says, incombustible. It cannot be burned. So again, you cannot burn a beam of light with a fire or with anything else. Although a beam of light can itself cause a fire, but not the other way around. The fire cannot put out a beam of light, but a beam of light can cause a fire. Now, an example of a special type of light which doesn't exist in nature is a laser beam. And a laser beam can absolutely cause a fire, or any light which you concentrate. So you remember probably science experiments which people may have done as children. You take a lens, and then you focus the lens on something like a piece of paper, and you'll find very soon, if there's enough sunlight shining on that lens, what happens? The piece of paper starts to burn. It starts to go black. Then in the next word, he says it cannot be dampened. And we looked at that in detail in the last verse, so I won't repeat here. Then he also says it cannot be dry. So the Atma is not something that with some breeze or with some air is going to shrivel up and die in any way. And we saw in the last verse, we took the example of a hurricane. It doesn't affect the path of the light, and it won't change its qualities either. So now, Bhagavan, having summarized the previous verse, comes out to different qualities of the Atma. And he first mentions, he says it is everlasting. Now, our current models of the universe imply it was neither created nor will it be destroyed. It will change form. But this is also logical because if we remember the first law of thermodynamics, it says energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can merely change form. Einstein's equation, if you remember, E equals mc squared. Yes, we're in Florida. You can tell, can't you, with the thunder if you can hear it in the background. But Einstein's equation also shows us that energy and matter, E equals mc squared, they're interchangeable, but they cannot be destroyed. Similarly, he says our spiritual side, the Atma will always be there because, as he puts it, it is everlasting. Then he says it's in all places everywhere. This is actually the most fascinating description of the Atma given 5,000 years ago. How can something be in all places everywhere? Now, if we look back at verse 13, you remember the article in Nature magazine. And I'm going to quote directly from it. So I'll read directly from it. That's something that scientists have long known is theoretically true, based on a few facts. Every particle or group of particles in the universe is also a wave. Even large particles, even bacteria, even human beings, even planets and stars. And waves occupy multiple places in space at once. So any chunk of matter can occupy two places at once. Physicists call this phenomenon quantum superposition. And for decades, they've demonstrated it using small particles. But Bhagavan is now saying more than that. He says the Atma exists in all places. Now, by referring to quantum physics, we can understand how that can be. But we must remember that the location of a particle only crystallizes when there is an observer. Now, in the spiritual dimension, there is no matter, and therefore there is in any case no location. In this context too, he means therefore the Atma exists in all places, throughout the spiritual realm. Why? Because as a wave, it's been traveling for eternity. So it's everywhere. Then he says it is unalterable. Now we took the example again of the beam of light. It's essentially unalterable because neither weapons, nor fire, nor water, nor wind, nor anything else basically can affect it in any way. The nature of the Atma is similar, but it is even more unalterable in that nothing can affect it. It is itself incapable of changing or being changed. So neither any internal force nor external force can cause it to alter. Then he uses the word immutable. This means it's unchanging or unable to be changed. Now, to help us understand this, let's think of photons, because that's what a light beam consists of, and we were looking at an example of a light beam. So let's think of the photons which make up the light beam. Given that light is still reaching us 13.8 billion years from the Big Bang, assuming the Big Bang occurred, and I'm not going to go into that right now, it can be said to be unchanging or unable to be changed, even though it reaches us through intergalactic space filled with stars, nebulae, planets, and all sorts of other things we probably do not know or understand even now. Now, current research shows that a photon is stable for 1 with 15 zeros after it, at least. That's the closest in the material world that we're going to get to immutable. The atom is immutable in the sense that unless something breaks it, it doesn't. The photon is immutable, but the Atma is immutable even more so. We said we went into what's the life of a photon. But now the Atma, he says, is for all time. But we have to be a little bit careful trying to understand the Atma in relation to time and saying it's there for all time. Because remember, time exists because of movement of planets around its star, the movement of the star around its galactic center, and so on. But the Atma doesn't recognize any time because it's not of the material world. We'll come to that in later chapters where we'll explain what do we mean when we say that Bhagavan himself, the Paramatma and the Atma, they are above space and time. And so in that context, we have to be very careful before we make use of the word time in relation to the Atma. Then he says it is primordial. Now, what does that mean? It means it's basic, absolutely fundamental to all existence. This has always existed. So once again, Sri Krishna is reiterating that the Atma was never created, nor, as we have seen, was a universe, since by definition, energy cannot be created or destroyed. The Atma too always existed and will never cease to exist. So let's go on to verse 25 and let's find out a little bit more about the Atma.
Gain more qualities of Atma in 25th. Avyaktoyam achintyoyam avikaryoyam uchyate tasmadevam viditvainam nanushochitumarhasi. Now Bhagavan is using again 4 more. He says first is avyaktaha. Avyaktaha means unmanifested or invisible. Then he says achintyaha. Achintyaha means which is not, or which is out of, or which is out of thoughts, or which is beyond thoughts or mind. Then he says avikaryaha. Avikarya means immutable. So Bhagavan says these are the nature or qualities of Atma. Tasmad evam viditva. Bhagavan says after knowing this kind of qualities of Atma, hey Arjun, he says, na anushochitumarasi. So Bhagavan is keeps saying him that after knowing the qualities of Atma, anushochitum, that means you don't need to worry or what we can say, sochitum, which is show.
Grief.
Grief, yeah. So one says that still you don't need to grieve for this because he was grieving for that this will be killed. So one says after knowing these qualities of Atma, you don't need to grieve. Yeah.
So he says the Atma is spoken of as invisible, something beyond the mind, inconceivable, and the intellect. Knowing this, he says, it is improper for you to grieve for the body. Now, Bhagavan is trying hard to put the Atma into terms that we can understand and imagine. So first, he says invisible. Well, that's not too difficult for us to understand. After all, the energy waves that accompany photons, electrons, molecules, they are invisible. That doesn't mean they do not exist. Similarly, the Atma is invisible, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Then he uses the word inconceivable. Now, he's trying very hard to explain the qualities of the Atma because, as he himself concedes, he himself says, it's almost impossible for a human being to imagine or grasp what is mentally the Atma because its qualities are so unbelievable and not something that we experience day to day. So then he says it is immutable or unchangeable. Now, is Bhagavan just repeating himself? He's already told us it is unalterable. So what is he trying to say? Something that is unalterable is something that by its very nature is incapable of change or becoming altered. Unchangeable also means it's incapable of being changed even by an outside agency. So Bhagavan explains that once we understand all of this, we should not grieve or sorrow for the body, which is the only thing that has ended. Note nowhere does he say we should not miss the presence of a loved one, that we should not miss the presence of the Atma as it was embodied in a loved one. He recognizes that we can no longer communicate with it, but what he's trying to tell us is that the Atma still continues to exist. It is only the form that has changed.
So in verse 26, again, one is adding that why you should not grieve. So one says, Tachainam nitya jatam nityam va manyase mrutam tathapi tvam mahabaho naivam shochitumarhasi. Bhagavan says, Atha enam nitya jatam. If you think that this is constant birth, it will take constant birth. Either nityam va manyase mrutam, or if you think that it will have constant death. Tathapi tvam. Again, He Mahabaho, He mighty Arjun, Naivam sochitumarhasi. Again, you don't need to grieve, because if you think that it will take birth constantly, and if it will die constantly, still you don't need to grieve. So this is what it says in verse 26.
So it says, if, however, you think that the self is subject to constant birth and death, O mighty Arjun, even then it is not befitting for you to grieve like this. So Sri Krishna now addresses Arjun as one who has mighty arms. Maybe he's also trying to tell Arjun that he'd like him to have a mighty, strong, resilient mind as well. So Bhagavan's now trying to use logic to explain to Arjun that, okay, I've described the Atma to you, but supposing you don't believe me, and you think that the Atma doesn't have all the qualities I have just enumerated, and instead you believe that the Atma is subject to creation and destruction, but he says even then it is not befitting for you to grieve. So why does he say it's not befitting? He explains why in the next verse. So we need to go on to verse 27, where Bhagavan will explain why he says it is not befitting for Arjun to grieve. Verse 27. So verse 27.
Jatasya hi dhruvo mrutyur dhruvam janmamrutasya cha tasmada pariharyerthe natvam sojitumarhasi. So in this verse, Bhagavan says not to grieve. He says, Jatasya hi dhruvo mrutyur. Who takes birth, dhruva means it is always there. It is certain. The one says birth has certainty that which will have death. Then says dhruvam janmamrutasya cha. So this is again, and this verse actually talks about rebirth. So he says dhruvam janmamrutasya cha. That means the person or whoever dies, it has birth. Tasmat apariharyerthe. Therefore, Bhagavan says this situation, natvam sochitumarhasi. Again, you don't need to grieve, because who takes birth, that has to die, and who dies, that has to take birth.
So Sri Krishna now explains that supposing you don't believe what I said about the Atma, that it's not unchanging, not undying, etc. But then he says death is certain for one who has been born. Rebirth is inevitable for one who has died. Therefore, you should not lament over the inevitable. So death and birth, he's saying, are opposite sides of the same coin. If you're born, then naturally you will die. And if you die, then naturally, he says, you will be born again. In other words, he's saying it is an inevitable, endless cycle. To understand this cycle, let's look at the cyclic nature of the universe itself. We can go back and look at verse 20 again, and let's look at the work of Professor Roger Penrose. We looked at that in verse 20. Now look at the work of Professor Paul Steinhardt, Albert Einstein Professor in Science, Princeton Center for Theoretical Science, Department of Physics. And he explains it this way. The cyclic universe theory is a model of cosmic evolution, according to which the universe undergoes endless cycles of expansion and cooling, each beginning with a big bang and ending in a big crunch. So to understand this better, let's look at the three phases. First, the Big Bang is not the beginning of space or time. It's rather a moment when the gravitational energy and other forms of matter are transformed into new matter. And radiation and a new period of expansion and cooling begins. So it's just a point in time. Second, bangs have occurred periodically in the past, and they will continue periodically in the future, repeating the cycle once every 10 to the power of 12 years. So the cycle may be a very, very long cycle. So our birth and death on this planet may be 70, 80 years, and the cycle repeats. The cycle of the universe is much, much, much longer, but it's still a cycle. Third, the sequence of events that set the large-scale structure of the universe that we observe today when we look up at the skies, it took place during a long period of slow contraction before the Big Bang. The events that will occur over the next 10 to the 12 years will set the large-scale structure for the cycle to come. So we're right in the middle of a cycle, and then there'll be another cycle. Note that 10 to the 12 is 1 trillion years, and this cycle carries on endlessly. Now in chapter 8, Sri Krishna will explain the cyclic nature of the universe. He himself will go into a little bit of detail. The Bhagavatam also mentions that universes are created, then destroyed, then created again. But the point Sri Krishna is making here is that all of these steps are inevitable. It's a cycle. It is not something that somebody's starting, somebody's stopping, there's any choice over. So in the same way, then by this logic, he says, well, the Atma would be created, but then it would be destroyed, but then it would be created again. So even by that logic, it is going to occur again. It will come back. His point is that the cycle is inevitable. So the logical question he's asking us is then, well, why grieve for what is inevitable? How will grieving change that which is inevitable? Because it's in the very nature of that which is created and destroyed. Now, what is inevitable, he's saying, is something we have to bring ourselves to accept. Verse 28.
So now he says, again, Avyaktadini bhutani tyaktamadhyani bharata avyakta nidhananyeva tatraka paridevana. He says, Avyaktadini bhutani. Bhutani means beings. So he says, Avyakta. Avyakta means unmanifested before birth. Vyakta madhyani bharata. Then they are visible or manifest when after birth. And then he says, Avyakta nidhanani. Nidhanam means death. So he says, after death again, they are object. They are unmanifested. One said, Tatraka paridevana. Again, Tatra means in that. Why you have to grieve? So Tatraka paridevana. So he's keep adding that why not to grieve.
So Bhagavan now says, O son of Bharat, all created beings are unmanifest before birth, manifest in life, and again manifest on death. So why grieve? Sri Krishna now calls Arjuna Bharat, reminding him he is the descendant of a very ancient and noble king. He's continuing with his very logical but we admit, very hard to implement argument as to why we should not grieve. It's very logical, but we all know that we do grieve. But Bhagavan is asking us to look at the logic of why we're grieving. So he says correctly that, well, until we are born, so until we put on the garment that is called the body, our Atma is not manifest to the senses of other people. We cannot be seen. He says then when we take birth, as soon as we take birth, we become manifest to the senses of other embodied Atmas, other people around us, the doctor, the nurses, the mother, the father, the aunts, the uncles. Suddenly they can see this Atma because it's embodied in a body. And those who have taken birth are also manifest to our senses. So we also can see all the people who are surrounding us. Now, when we die, to the embodied Atmas who remain on the planet, we once more become unmanifest. Now, interestingly, Bhagavan does not say here or anywhere that we are not manifest to Atmas who are not embodied. It's an issue he doesn't address. So in other words, the person who is gone, who shed their body, they're now in the spiritual world. Are they able to see us or not? He doesn't actually comment on that, and Arjuna never asks him. So if we wanted the answer, we can blame Arjuna saying, why did you ask him? It's too late now. So we can look at it another way. When we open our eyes and use instruments, we can see a molecule, a virus, or a bacteria. But if we close our eyes, we cannot feel or sense or see the energy wave which we know exists. Looking back to the two-slit experiment. When we close our eyes, the object is no longer manifest to us, even though its energy is still all around us. And it's the same with the Atma. We cannot see it, but the energy is still all around us. So why, Sri Krishna then asks Arjuna, are you grieving over what is inevitable, natural, and logical? In addition, Sri Krishna is commenting in a very practical way about the past, the present, and the future. One can only live in and deal with the present. The past is behind us. The future is invisible. All one can deal with is the present. And that's what he's asking us to do, saying, well, deal with the present. Don't deal with the unmanifest before, the unmanifest after. Just deal with the present.
Yeah, sweet. Verse 29. Ascharyavat pasyati kaschinenam ascharyavat vadati tathaiva chanyaha ascharyavat chainamanya shrunoti srutvapyenam vedana chaiva kaschita. Now one says, Ascharyavat pasyati kaschit enam. Enam is this Atma. Surprisingly, somebody or someone, enam pasyati is seeing. So Bhagavan says, someone seeing this Atma surprisingly. Ascharyavat vadati tathaiva chanya. There are some who are saying about this Atma differently. Ascharyavat chainam anyah shrunoti. And the people who are listening or hearing about this, they are also surprisingly hearing or listening. Bhagavan says, Srutvapi enam. After even listening about this, Vedana chaiva kaschita. That person doesn't know. So Bhagavan is here, he is saying that he's showing three objects of senses, that how these people conceive this Atma. First he says Pashyati, means seeing. Second, he says Vadati, means speaking or saying about that. And then he says Shrunoti, hearing or listening about. But still, one says that person doesn't know.
So he says, some see the Atma as amazing. Some describe it as amazing. And some hear of the Atma as amazing, while others, even on hearing, cannot understand it at all. Well, let's try not to be in that last category of hearing. We still cannot understand it at all because he's given us lots and lots of examples to help us understand it.
Yeah.
So Bhagavan now in this verse is going back again to the nature of the Atma. He says, some see this Atma as astonishing or amazing. Others talk about it, describe it as amazing. And some listen to the qualities of the Atma and understand that it is amazing. But he's saying there are others, even having had all the descriptions and all the information, really cannot understand at all. Although, as I said, in the physical world, he has given us lots of examples which can help us to understand what the Atma is. Now, when we don't have adequate knowledge or information, we're obviously in a position where we simply cannot understand something. And that's why he's trying to give us information. Now, just 5,000 years ago in the West, they thought the universe was simple and ordered. The sun and other planets rotated around the Earth. Yes, no, I'm saying it the right way around. The sun and the other planets rotated around the Earth, is what they thought. And at no great distance. The Earth itself was stationary. The stars were little points of light mounted on a crystal sphere. Now, completely lacking in science, not having the scope of thinking and minds of the ancient rishis of India, how could they possibly have contemplated the sheer scale of even this small galaxy? And this is a small galaxy. There are about 100 billion stars in our galaxy, Milky Way. Andromeda has 1 trillion stars. So how could they have even contemplated this? Or contemplated numbers like Brahma's day, which is 4.32 billion years. So if someone had even tried to explain such numbers or concepts to what were Western scientists in those days, they could not have understood it at all. So by the way, just in case we are doubting the extraordinary minds of our seers, I just want to look at a few facts. The Earth is now 4.543 billion years old, latest estimates. In around another billion years, Earth will be threatened with lethal levels of radiation from the sun. Will become too hot to support liquid water. In 2.8 billion years from now, the surface temperature of our planet will have reached 149 degrees centigrade, 300 degrees Fahrenheit, even at the poles. At this point, any remaining life will be extinguished because of the extreme conditions. At this point, its biosignatures will also disappear, which means that if an alien from somewhere else in the universe came to the Earth, they would never even know that this now dead planet was once teeming with life. There would be literally no evidence of it. In 4.5 to 5 billion years, our sun will become what's called a red giant. As it expands, it will engulf the Earth, which will therefore literally cease to exist. Now, note that Brahma's day is 4.32 billion years. Brahma's night is 4.32 billion years, a total of 8.64 billion years. Now, if we look at the figures above, the Earth is now 4.5 billion years. In another 4.5 billion years, what did we say? It will cease to exist completely, which is a total of around 9 billion years of existence. Compare this to Brahma's day and Brahma's night, 8.64 billion years. Stunningly accurate for something written thousands of years ago. Now, could Western scientists have even begun to understand these concepts even 500 years ago? No. And Bhagavad is explaining that we are facing the same problem in trying to understand the Atma. We are as backward about the Atma as Western scientists were about, the universe. This is despite the fact that we're fortunate enough to live in an age where we have access to information. Like all matter has 2 aspects. One being the material, visible to us, other being the energy wave, invisible to us. So it's not surprising that we find it hard to understand. But let's try to understand it, and let's go on to his next description, verse 30.
Dehi nityam avadhyoyam dehe sarvasya bharata tasmat sarvani bhutani natvam shojitumarhasi. Again, Bhagavan is adding it. He said, Dehi nityam avadhyoyam dehe sarvasya bharata. So Bhagavan is using 2 words here, Deha and Dehi. Deha is body, and Dehi means the body which is owned by, which is Atma. So Bhagavan says, Dehi nityam avadhyaha. Avadya means immortal. So Bhagavan says that this Atma is always immortal. And tasmat sarvani bhutani, all creatures, within their creatures, whatever the Atma is, immortal. Natvam sochitum arhasi. Again, Bhagavan says that why you have to grieve, or you don't need to grieve.
So he says, "Oh Arjun, the Atma that dwells within the body is immortal. Therefore, you should not mourn for anyone." So you saw in the last few verses, Bhagavan said, well, okay, supposing you don't believe me, and the Atma is not immortal and is going to be born and die and born and die. And he gave the kind of logical outcomes. But now he's saying, well, I've given you those logical outcomes, but my own position is that it is eternal. It is immortal. So this is really a summary statement to everything he has said about the Atma in detail in the prior verses that we've been going through. The word Dehi, as Jinichi says, indicates the body belongs to the Atma does not belong to the body. Now, based on these facts, he tells Arjun, you should not mourn for anyone. There's nothing for you to mourn about. Look at verse 31.
31, yes. Swadharmam apichavikshya navikampitum dharmyadhiyuddha shreyonyat kshatriyasya na vidyate. So Bhagavan is saying here, Swadharmam apicha avikshya. Swadharma means your own dharma, your own duty. After seeing your own duty, Bhagavan said, na vikampitum arhasi. Vikampitum means you don't need to waver, or you don't need to have fear. Dharmyadi yuddha shreyonyat. Yuddha, Bhagavan is saying yuddha for, so here he is using word kshatriya. Kshatriya means warrior. So one says for warriors, there is no better dharma or there is no better duty than yuddha. So he says when warrior gets to have war or to fight for war, he said that is the best duty any warrior can get. So that was the lesson of this.
So he says, besides, considering your duty as a warrior, you should not fear. Indeed, for a warrior, there is no better engagement than fighting for upholding of righteousness. Now, before we say Bhagavan is advocating fighting even for a warrior, please note the last 4 words, for upholding of righteousness, not for any other reason. So Bhagavan has now left aside the spiritual need to fight the war. He's going back to summarize the duties of a warrior. So he's asking Arjun to consider, what are your duties as a warrior or a soldier? What are you here for? And this is an issue for every nation today. What is the role of the military? Does a country own the military, or does the military own a country? A lot of countries could ask themselves that question. But NATO summarizes it as follows. The purpose of a military is to defend their own country and participate in the collective defense of the alliance of allies. It's to provide humanitarian aid, to perform search and rescue missions, provide assistance in disasters, provide assistance in accidents, participate in maintaining public order with and without arms by providing administrative assistance, performing protective functions, assisting the police in emergencies. And we can see military throughout the world which do carry out humanitarian missions as well, assisting in accidents, helping to rebuild hospitals, and so on. So in short, the soldier or the military as a whole, if we can put it, is there to protect and serve civilian society. To put all the things NATO says, what are they basically doing? Yes, in a situation of a war, they're actively defending their civilian society. But when you talk about rescue missions, humanitarian aid, it means that they're to serve civilian society, even in peacetime. So years ago, Bhagavan was actually asking Arjun to carry out this very responsibility without fear. In other words, without hesitation. In 2019, the RAND Corporation published a research paper called Will to Fight, summarizing 2 reports produced for the US Army. Now, in it they state, and it's quite interesting, arguably, The will to fight is the single most important factor in war. Will to fight is the disposition and decision to fight, to keep fighting, and to win. The best technology in the world is useless without the force of will to use it and to keep using it, even as casualties mount and unexpected calamities arise. The will to fight represents the indelibly human nature of warfare. They then produce a fascinating graph showing the army's focus on training soldiers on having a will to fight. And the results are actually quite interesting. I'll share them with you. In 1895, the US Army published Organization and Tactics. Between 1895 and 1905, so it's 10-year spans, the will to fight was quite strong. It then declined between 1905 and 1920. But as there were no battles in these years, the decline had no impact. But then between 1920 to 1965, so 45-year span, the Army focused on training, issuing field service regulations, small wars manual, and a field manual. Those years saw World War II and the Korean War, which the US fought successfully. The will to fight was very strong. Between 1960 and 1980, the focus on the will to fight declined. It's not that technology declined, the will to fight declined. And the US had the disastrous Vietnam War, fleeing from the rooftops of the embassy. Between 1980 and 2000, the Army refocused on the need to have soldiers with a will to fight. They successfully fought the Persian Gulf Wars. Between 2000 and 2010, the will to fight again declined, and the US essentially fought its war on terror, but was successful in taking out Osama bin Laden. So that was a win. There's no analysis available past 2010, although in 2016, the Army began to focus again on the importance of soldiers having the will to fight. In other words, the will to fight in soldiers is an absolutely critical ingredient of the ability to have a victory. Hence, Bhagwan's insistence that Arjuna needs to keep fighting without hesitation, without wavering. Now, in addition, Sri Krishna asks, what could be better for a soldier than having the opportunity to fight for that which is right? Not having the opportunity to fight, the opportunity to fight for that which is right if it becomes necessary to fight for that which is right. And remember, in verse 18, we covered the British Navy's fight against slavery. For a soldier, what is better than fighting a war that he knows to be something for what is right? So we will leave it here, and then next week we will carry on with the next verses of chapter 2, which is, I think, the second longest chapter in the Gita. So we will continue with it, and we hope you are enjoying it. But thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Namaste, Jai Shri Krishna.
Yes.